Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Calvin Coolidge, and the focus is Rise to National Prominence. The year is 1919, it's September, and Coolidge for the first time is a national figure based on his recent performance in the Boston police strike in favor of law and order and duty, some themes that were resonating across the country. And Coolidge's friend Frank Stearns wanted to capitalize on this. Knowing that a presidential election was right around the corner, he put a book together of Coolidge's speeches. They called it Have Faith in Massachusetts, which was one of the titles of one of those speeches, included his public comments from the time during the Boston police strike, and he mailed this out not just in Massachusetts but around the country, trying to influence folks thinking ahead to the next election at the national level. In the meantime, though, Coolidge had to win his own state re-election. He was up for governor again in 1919, and this time it was a breeze. The previous year he had won by just 17,000 votes. This time he won by 125,000 votes, obviously based on his recent performance. In fact, he did so well he almost won the vote in Boston, which was frankly unheard of for a Republican at this time. Now, Coolidge had another major duty to perform as governor. A recent constitutional amendment required the governor to basically reorganize state government, to take over 100 state agencies and commissions and whittle them down to 20. The big part about this was he was going to have to eliminate many senior positions, including friends and colleagues. So this was politically perilous for Coolidge. In fact, so much so that he did basically all of this work by himself. In the end, it was quite praised. He did create some political enemies at the small level, but in the big picture, most people thought Coolidge did a great job, even though this was very much a thankless task. Coolidge even remarked that they say the police strike required executive courage. Reorganizing 118 departments into 18 required a good deal more, but Coolidge did that job well. Now, for the 1920 presidential election, again, as folks were looking forward to that, the Republicans had been kind of leaning toward Theodore Roosevelt coming back into the race, perhaps being the Republican nominee again after sort of splitting with the party back in 1912. But Roosevelt died the previous year, and that left a wide open set of circumstances for a bunch of candidates to maybe jump into the mix. Stearns, of course, was pushing for Coolidge's name, and Bruce Barton, who is a reporter, wrote the following in Collier's, advocating for someone like Coolidge. He said, "The great majority of Americans are neither radicals nor reactionaries. They're middle-of-the-road folks who own their own homes, work hard, would like to have a government get back to its old habits of meddling with their lives as little as possible. It sometimes seems as if this great silent majority had no spokesman. But Coolidge belongs with that crowd. He lives like them, he works like them, and understands." So there was some momentum in this direction, and again, Stearns wanted to capitalize. So he hired one of the leading Republican operatives by the name of James Reynolds to run the campaign. They set up offices in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago, Chicago being the home of the Republican convention again that year, and almost immediately after that, Coolidge shut the whole thing down. He said, "Look, I need to focus on my job as governor of Massachusetts. I'm not going to waste time campaigning for something when there's already other front runners that are ahead of him in the race for the Republican nomination. Maybe they could keep his name in the mix. If there was a deadlock at the convention, he could be a good dark horse candidate, but he wasn't going to spend a lot of time or a lot of money running for president for the nomination here in the early part of 1920. Well, who were those leading candidates? There were really three for the 20 Republican nomination, and it was Leonard Wood, the Army Chief of Staff, who was kind of at the top of the list. He was the Roosevelt candidate. He had been Roosevelt's commanding officer in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. He had then served for President Roosevelt during Roosevelt's term in the White House, and he was very much seen as carrying the banner forward for Theodore Roosevelt here in the 20 election. Illinois Governor Frank Lowden was also in the mix. Now, he was the closest to Coolidge. He was a governor. He'd just taken control of the state budget in the executive branch in Illinois. That was similar to Coolidge, what he had done in Massachusetts. He had also clamped down on some strikes, so similar to what Coolidge might bring to the table, with a little bit more notoriety across the country. Then you had the progressive candidate, the senator from California, Hiram Johnson. Now, Johnson had been part of the progressive split from the Republicans back in 1912. Most of those Republicans had now come back into the fold. Johnson was looking to represent the progressive wing of the party and perhaps get that nomination. Now, this was going to be hard for any of them because three strong candidates with strong bases, to see one of them get a majority at the convention, It was going to be difficult, perhaps a deadlock, perhaps a case for a dark horse, and that's certainly what Stearns was thinking when he went to the convention with Reynolds by his side. This is Chicago, June of 1920, and Coolidge's name was in the mix. It was introduced as a nominee for president by his own congressman, Fred Gillett, who happened to be the Speaker of the House of U.S. Representatives, so certainly a prominent gentleman who said that Coolidge is as patient as Lincoln, as silent as Grant, as diplomatic as McKinley, with the political instinct of Roosevelt. His character is as firm as the mountains of his native state. Like them, his head is above the clouds, and he stands unshaken amid the tumult and the storm. That's what Gillett was saying about Coolidge, and there was a rousing round of applause for about a minute. For the other candidates, leading candidates, these ovations would go on for 30, 40, 45 minutes, something like that. Coolidge got a little recognition, but look, Coolidge didn't even have the unanimous support of his own delegation in Massachusetts, because Wood had actually won the primary in Massachusetts, so the Massachusetts delegation was split. Coolidge's name was in the mix, but frankly, he never got a lot of votes when the roll call started counting for President of the United States. Now, we covered a lot about the 1920 Republican Convention in an episode under Warren Harding, the dark horse from Ohio. We're not going to repeat all of that information here in this episode, but we used to say after the first day of balloting, there was a group of senators who got together in a smoke-filled room at the Blackstone Hotel. They basically concluded that if neither of the first three candidates could break through the next day, they were going to have to look for a second-tier candidate, and for that, they wanted one of their own senators, Warren Harding of Ohio. Coolidge's name was mentioned a little bit in this room, but not very prominently. It was Harding who emerged, and in fact, the next day, when none of the leading three could break through, Harding eventually got the nomination for president on the 10th ballot. What about vice president? Well, the senators also wanted one of their own in that category, and they were leaning toward Irvine Lenroot from Wisconsin. But in this case, there was a backlash among the delegates. They felt they were being dictated to by those senators, what they called the Senate cabal, and there was a lot of resistance to this, just having another senator handpicked by the existing senators to take over as VP, along with Harding perhaps at the top of the ticket. So there was a backlash and a change. A man named Wallace McCamant stepped forward as he had gotten one of those copies of that book, Have Faith in Massachusetts, about Coolidge, and really liked what Coolidge had done as governor of California. He's from the Oregon delegation, other side of the country, but still, he got up on his chair, he put Coolidge's name into nomination for vice president, calling him a man whose name traveled all across the country last fall when he stood for law and order and for the safety of the republic. Those actions in the police strike still resonating with folks across the country for Calvin Coolidge. Now, what happened next was a stampede for Calvin Coolidge. Lenroot was sort of a thing of the past. All of a sudden, everybody's chanting Coolidge's name. In fact, Chauncey Depew said this to Coolidge later: "I've been present at every Republican convention beginning with 1856. I've never seen such a spontaneous and enthusiastic tribute to a man as the vote for you for vice president." It happened sort of just like that. On the first ballot, Calvin Coolidge got the nomination of the Republican Party for Vice President of the United States. The question was, would he even accept it? Earlier in the primary season, the folks in South Dakota had put Coolidge's name forward as a potential vice presidential candidate, and he wrote him a very nice letter saying, look, I'm not interested in that job. But now he's sitting in the Adams House Hotel in Boston with his wife, Grace, gets a phone call telling him what had just happened. And this is the conversation between Coolidge and his wife. Coolidge said, "Nominated for vice president." His wife responded, "You don't mean it." "Indeed I do," he replied. "Well, you're not going to accept it, are you?" she asked. "I suppose I shall have to." So Coolidge did agree that he would become the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. Now, for the Republican Party, for the Democrats, they were meeting in San Francisco to figure out who their candidate was going to be, and they went with Ohio Governor James Cox, the VP candidate, Franklin Roosevelt of New York, the future president. He's nominated for vice president. Now, both Cox and Roosevelt were very much aligned with the incumbent president, Woodrow Wilson, specifically about the League of Nations, which was very controversial at the time. The country and the political leadership very much split, but Cox and Roosevelt barnstormed the country, really advocating for the League and a lot of Wilson's policies. For the Republicans, a very different kind of campaign. Warren Harding a front porch campaign from his front porch in Marion, Ohio, where he welcomed visitors almost on a daily basis. Thousands and thousands got to know sort of the folksy character of Harding, who was campaigning on a campaign of a return to normalcy, kind of back to basics for the United States. No more of these sort of massive reforms from the progressive side of the party, and a very much of an America first mentality, which is pretty different from what Wilson had been advocating from the Oval Office from the Democratic side. Now, for Calvin Coolidge, what was his job during the campaign? Not a lot. Mostly support the top of the ticket. He did get his one day in the sun. This is July the 27th, notification day, when everybody did converge onto Northampton, Massachusetts to formally give Coolidge the nomination for vice president from the Republican Party. And again, thousands gathering at Allen Field at Smith College, and Coolidge did formally accept, saying at the time, "The destiny, the greatness of America lies around the hearthstone. If thrift and industry are taught there, and the example of self-sacrifice oft appears, if honor abide there and high ideals, if there the building of fortune be subordinate to the building of character, America will live in security, rejoicing in an abundant prosperity and good government at home and in peace, respect, and confidence abroad." Mostly, though, Coolidge is pretty quiet in the campaign. He did go on behalf of the party leaders to take some speeches into the South. He went on a tour there. This was very much Democratic country, so not very friendly, but Coolidge felt it was his duty to do whatever, frankly, the party wanted him to, so he did that. He also went to Marion, Ohio, where he met with Harding. In fact, Grace went with him. Very cordial, very friendly. In fact, Harding came out and said, "Look, I want Coolidge to be part of my administration. I want him to sit in on cabinet meetings," which is very much not the tradition for vice presidents at the time. So this was a positive thing as well. But frankly, most of the time, Coolidge went back to Plymouth Notch, hung out with his father on the farm for much of the campaign period, where a lot of reporters came. They're trying to learn about Calvin Coolidge. Who is this guy? Had plenty of pictures taken of him, sort of, again, doing work on the farm, the simple Puritan tastes of Coolidge from his Vermont background. This is sort of what he brought to the table, in which was a landslide victory for the Coolidge, or for the Harding-Coolidge ticket. And again, this was very much with Woodrow Wilson's name not on the ballot, but his policies very much were. The country kind of a backlash against that, against Wilson's sort of elitist personality, kind of dictating to them, but mostly it was thought that he was not with an America First agenda. He was looking more broadly at the world with his League of Nations, and frankly, Harding's message, his more folksy message about America First and return to normalcy, that's kind of what people wanted, and he wins easily, 404 to 127 in the Electoral College. In fact, the popular vote, Harding and Coolidge got more than 60% of the popular vote, and both houses of Congress, strong majorities for the Republicans. Fast forward a couple of months, you've got the inauguration, March 4th of 1921. Calvin Coolidge actually takes his oath first as vice president. He did so in the Senate chamber in the inside, gave a brief address talking to the body that he was about to oversee. It was Coolidge who said that the great object for us to seek here, for the Constitution identifies the vice presidency with the Senate, is to continue to make this chamber, as it was intended by the fathers, the citadel of liberty. Now, what would that role be for Calvin Coolidge as vice president? Well, not very much in terms of official duties. He did sit in on those cabinet meetings, didn't really say much, but he did observe and listen and learn. He did preside over the Senate, but again, vice presidents can't engage in debate. They can't vote unless there's a tie vote. So what was Calvin Coolidge's approach to being the presiding officer of the Senate? Well, I soon found that the Senate had but one fixed rule, subject to exceptions, of course, which was to the effect that the Senate would do anything it wanted to do whenever it wanted to do it. When I learned that, I did not waste much time on the other rules because they were so seldom applied. So this is mostly a ceremonial role. Where did the Coolidges decide to live? Well, Grace moved with him from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. He now has the biggest salary he's ever had, $12,000 a year, but they deemed it too expensive to buy a home in Washington, D.C. So what did they do? They took up an offer from the outgoing vice president, Thomas Marshall. They said, "Why don't you move into my suite at the New Willard Hotel? Two-bedroom suite, dining room, large reception room." Coolidge said, "Yes, that's befitting of a vice president. It's right next to the White House." He did chafe at the $8 a day fee that he had to pay for that, but again, he's making 12 grand, so he could certainly afford it. The problem with the New Willard was it was not going to be a good place to raise the boys. They're now in high school years, so Grace Coolidge found him a boarding school not that far away, just on the other side of the Pennsylvania border in Mercersburg Academy in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, and it was about 90 miles away, and that's where the boys would go to school. So what did Coolidge do during a lot of his times during vice president? Well, he actually accepted quite a few invitations to go out and speak at dinners, which is a little bit odd because, of course, Coolidge didn't like the sort of the chit-chat that you would get in some of these things. So why did he do it? Well, he said basically, got to eat somewhere. He also liked the perk of the fact that he was the guest of honor. He could arrive late, he could leave early, still get home to bed by 10 o'clock. Now, besides, the person who was really the star of these events was Grace Coolidge. That's who everybody adored. She was charming, she was social, she was outgoing. Her husband was taciturn, did not really engage much in conversation, but Grace was there, and so she was sort of the star of the party at many of these events. Now, unlike Warren Harding, again, very different personality for Calvin Coolidge. Harding and his crowd, they were up all night, poker parties, swapping stories, alcohol being served in the White House despite the fact that Prohibition had passed. Coolidge had nothing to do with this side of the administration. Again, he went to bed early. He was not into the poker playing. That was not part of his job or his experience as vice president. But from a policy standpoint, he and Harding work almost completely aligned. Harding was pushing for high protective tariffs, low income taxes, centralization of the budget so we could cut government spending, curtail immigration, all part of this sort of America First kind of agenda. For all of that, Calvin Coolidge was completely aligned. In terms of the job, look, the first 2 years, his 2 years as vice president, were pretty frustrating because, again, he didn't really have a lot to do that was meaningful, but he had to be in Washington, D.C. most of that time because Congress was almost in continuous session during those first 2 years. So finally, by March of 1923, it was time for a break. Congress went home. The president was going to go west. He was going to become the first president to go visit Alaska, the Alaska Territory, and that meant that Coolidge could take a bit of a break. He gave some speeches, including the commencement address at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. He said there to the graduates, individual initiative in the long run is a firmer reliance than bureaucratic supervision. When the people work out their own economic and social destiny, they generally reach sound conclusions. We do not need more material development. We need more spiritual development. We do not need more intellectual power. We need more moral power. We do not need more knowledge. We need more culture. We do not need more law. We need more religion. Some of the sentiments still echoing from his days at Amherst when Professor Charles Garman was teaching him philosophy and ethics. A lot of that coming through here in this and many of Coolidge's addresses. He also gave an address in New Hampshire on Memorial Day. He went to Virginia for Independence Day. But then he was really heading home to his father's home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, for what he expected to be a pretty quiet summer. It turned out to be anything but. But that's the story for another day. That's Calvin Coolidge and the rise to national prominence from the life of Calvin Coolidge. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles.